Marshall from Float On has become a bit of a John Lilly expert, and boy, are you in for a wild ride on today's episode. We learned so much about John Lilly, our government, and, just absolutely unexpected things that all converge between John Lilly and float therapy. And it is absolutely fascinating and might change how you think about floating and certainly the history of float tanks. So definitely give this one a listen. Before we get started, of course, I want to shout out HelmBot. Whether you are an existing float center who is expanding, changing your offerings, or you're a new float center, you simply owe it to yourself to get a hold of the people at HelmBot. Schedule a tour with them and see if it's a good fit for you. I implore you to check them out because I think it will be a good fit. What they do is now for float tanks, massage, yoga, teaching classes, no matter what kind of setup you have for your float center or what you're adding to it, cold plunge, infrared sauna, they are now able to put that on the schedule, and people can purchase a la carte packages, however you want it, and do their own scheduling. It's something that we used at the Flip Shop for, I don't even know how many years now, and we absolutely love it. And we've done everything at our place, and including yoga classes, including massage, acupuncture, room rentals. I mean, you name it, we've done it. And we absolutely love HelmBot. So definitely do yourself a favor and go to helmbot.com. And again, just schedule that tour. Don't take my word for it. Talk with them, make sure it can do everything that you want, and make sure it's a good fit for you. Again, helmbot.com is where you want to go. Also want to give a shout out to the FTA. Again, whether you're a first time, starting your planning for your float center or you already exist, there's so much information that the FTA can provide you. You don't have to scour the web for little bits of information. Go to flotation.org. FLOAT, flotation.org, and check out the website. Become a member, support the group that supports all of us, and get a wealth of information, all the things that you need to know to set up your float center and be in the know, be educated, and of course, be part of the community, which is so important as well. They do so many other things as well, including live webinars, bringing experts in, having roundtables. By joining, you're getting a lot back for yourself to help your own float center be as functional, safe, and financially viable as possible. Again, go to flotation.org to check them out. All right, let's start that show. Welcome back to another episode of Art of the Float, where float centers thrive. My name is Dylan, and I own the Float Shop in Portland, Oregon, with my lovely wife, Sandra.
And this is Drew from New Hampshire Float in the quiet little state of New Hampshire.
Marshall is from Float On here in where I'm located in Portland, Oregon. And is there anything else you'd like to share, like how long you've been with Float On, maybe a little bit of your journey?
Yeah. So I've been with Float On since 2012.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I started there as an intern. So I've been in nice. The industry for a while. And I learned about John C. Lilly. I've known about him even longer since I was in college, and I randomly picked up a book of his off of a shelf in the library called Simulations of God. And it was an interesting book. I was interested in the psychedelic movement, altered states of consciousness, college stuff. And I've kind of been, I've definitely been interested in him since then. And over the last few years, it's turned into more of a serious study, potentially, for a book. And I've talked about it on my podcast as well. I have a podcast called Deep State History. It's sort of like the other half of my life as far as interests go. Or
deep
maybe
state. That's a powerful word right now. When you say deep state history, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. And I try to. All right, let me get this out there. I was using this phrase before anybody.
Okay.
Not
It got loaded afterward.
It got loaded a few years ago. Uh-huh. But I think what it basically is the concept of power outside of the regular electoral electorally elected, system of government we have. It's kind of where government and private interests intersect in a way that's not acknowledged. This goes it applies to anything from, like backroom deals, bribery, that sort of thing, and just other ways that people exert that power through government.
That just sounds like our government.
Yeah, it is. Well, there's the part of the government that we, elect, and then there is the power structures behind it that basically tell them what to do. I think it's pretty widely acknowledged that the will of the majority of people isn't always represented in government, and oftentimes it's private power that exerts more influence. I hope that's not too controversial.
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to meet somebody who didn't agree with that. I think maybe people would disagree with whom and all that, but I think as a generalized statement, I don't know anybody who would disagree with that for sure. Now, does that dovetail into John Lilly, or
it does? It does very much in ways I didn't understand until later. But so it's this fascinating intersection between my two interests, floating and the deep straight, and that's what I'm researching and talking about.
And if it isn't clear to our listeners already, that's what we're here to talk to Marshall about. Marshall is extremely knowledgeable on Dr. Lilly, and I think he'll go into a little bit of his history and his history with floating if you're unaware of it, and then I think we'll get deeper and deeper into it.
Yeah. So as float tank owners and operators, I'm sure everybody has been asked where these tanks come from, why were they created, who invented them, and there is I feel like we mostly all tell the same story about John C. Lilly. It's told in his books, his autobiographies. He was trying to separate, I guess, consciousness from external stimulation. Talked about trying to see if the subjective mind even exists absent of external stimulation. And there's a sort of debate going on between the behaviorism school of psychology and I guess more, newer thought. I'm not sure what the other school was off the top of my head. And so the story goes, John C. Lilly was interested in these issues and created the float tank to explore consciousness separated from external stimuli. And it's true for the most part, but it's also missing some very key elements. And I feel like after I explain this, it's going to be difficult to answer the question of where float tanks came from.
Interesting.
So I'm sorry for complicating everybody's lives out there, because I guess what I would say, and I'm not sure if I would want to say this to a client, is that float tanks really spun off of a top secret government project into brainwashing and mind control. And that is why we have them. So this started in the 50s, and I'll start by explaining the two main projects that the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was working on. The first, or one of the first, was called Artichoke. And then a more well-known one is called MKUltra. So these were happening in the 50s during the Cold War. And we didn't actually learn about them until the 70s when a bunch of documents were released under Freedom of Information Act requests. And what we know about them actually is just a very small amount compared to what was actually there, because most of the documents relating to MKUltra, Project Artichoke, and other programs were destroyed. They were burned and shredded. So we do have there's boxes that were left over somehow. And these were eventually collected by a guy named John Marks, who wrote about them in a book called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. He also spoke with Lilly. So Lilly actually helped him write portions of the book and explained, part of what was going on. He also left out some pertinent details about himself when he was explaining this to John Marks. So the point is, we have a very partial view of what was happening because of all these lost documents. But what we do have it is voluminous. There's a lot of information out there. So sensory deprivation comes into this from about the year 1951. Agents of the CIA were meeting with members of the Canadian Defense Board, I believe. The Canadian Defense Research Board. It was a meeting of the minds to talk about what they called brain warfare. It took place at a Ritz-Carlton hotel in Montreal, and present at this meeting was a man named Dr. Donald Hebb. And he is really the father of sensory deprivation. He started out teaching sensory deprivation not teaching it, experimenting on sensory deprivation in rodents. He was also I think he was like the head of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Association. So he was in this meeting, and it was Hebb who proposed sensory deprivation studies as a way of approaching brainwashing and mind control. So
can I pause for just a second? And
Sure.
You're probably going to get there anyway. But when you say sensory deprivation, when they're talking about sensory deprivation, what does that mean to them at that time?
Right. Well, so Lilly's method hadn't been developed yet. So what Hebb was doing was it resembles what's called the dry method now. You have goggles over your eyes that block out all the light. You'd have a headset on that blocks out all the sound. You're sitting reclining in a chair, and they would actually put like these cardboard tubes over your arms so you can't feel anything. So instead of being like total darkness, just kind of like seeing like just an all white field and, noise cancellation or whatever.
There's video of this. I've seen this, like arms in tubes. I think Dr. Feinstein showed that maybe at a float conference.
Yeah.
Extremely disturbing.
It doesn't sound great. But Hebb, so those were the initial experiments Hebb was doing at McGill University, which is I believe in Montreal. And he was doing this initially for the Canadian Defense Department. But once his experiments were leaked, there's a little bit of a public uproar. He continued doing them under a contract from the CIA's Human Ecology Fund. So the Human Ecology Fund was a front that the CIA created to fund research studies for MKUltra all over the country. And they poured an enormous amount of money in this. And like really a lot of the behavioral sciences of the 50s were tied to MKUltra because they really like went that far into it.
Was this research, like, let's go back to Canada before the U.S. funding it. Are these illegal experiments? Are these people signing up for this and signing their waiver, or what's
they were legal in the sense like it was voluntary. They were covert. They're experiments that weren't released and are classified. So some of it we don't know, but for the most part, what Hebb was doing was using volunteers. Now that is not to say that all the MKUltra experiments were legal. And I saw Drew using volunteers in quotes they were mostly hungry college students who wanted to make $15 a day. But one of Hebb's colleagues was Ewan Cameron, and he he took Hebb's experiments to extreme levels, and he's like rather famous for pioneering something called psychic driving, which combined sensory deprivation and a long list of drugs and repeated audio messages played into people's minds over and over and over again. That was at the same university. And Ewan Cameron also was the head of the American Psychiatric Association or Psychological Association. So these guys were basically at the tops of their field. And it was a secret that they were taking CIA money to do this. So what was publicly known about was done under the guise of being just like standard research done for the field in these institutions, when like the people that were paying for the research and using it for their own purposes were the CIA or other intelligence agencies too. So, yeah, Hebb was doing these experiments, and Lilly was working at the National Institute of Mental Health, and under the advice or the directions of a guy named Robert Swain Morrison, who worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, which was like a huge funder of all these behavioral science programs as well, went to visit Donald Hebb and observed his sensory deprivation tank experiments, or not tanks, his dry method. And he went back to the National Institutes of Mental Health and proposed his new version, which was the original wet method, which is, I'm sure we all know, is like when you're suspended completely under the water with a big helmet over your head, feeding you air. And yeah, it's like the extreme, very interesting experiments. So he was doing these on himself and one volunteer to start out with. So the exact reason why he was chosen to do these experiments is not exact. I would say it's still up in the air. Like I don't believe that it was completely his own, like nothing but his own curiosity that led him to do this. There were also other members of the National Institute for Mental Health working on sensory deprivation at the time, including a guy named Maitland Baldwin, who was working right next to Lilly, according to Lilly, at the National Institute of Mental Health, and he was also conversing directly with the CIA, specifically a guy named Morse Allen, who ran Project Artichoke. So Maitland Baldwin's method was just to put somebody in a box. He had a military volunteer. He locked the guy in a soundproof and lightproof box until the guy kicked and screamed and like basically kicked his way out of the box, I believe a few days later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So why was the CIA interested in this? Again, like the idea was that if you put somebody in sensory deprivation long enough, their mind kind of dissolves in a way. Like you're cutting off the external stimulation. You reach a state of like suggestibility, they believed, and they thought like your beliefs could be reversed under these conditions. So if you separate somebody from the things that reinforce their beliefs and their thinking, and then input only your own or what you choose to go into them, whether usually in the form of like audio recordings, theoretically, according to these guys, you could eventually brainwash them into hating what they once loved,
sure.
Adopting any, point of view you want. So that was the idea. And they did.
And not, it seems obvious, but it should be said, this would be torture and illegal. Like at that point, its application would be outside of human rights.
Yes. Well, it could. I mean, not actually,
or perhaps
not necessarily.
therapeutically, perhaps
exactly therapeutically. Okay. Like, so, one idea is like if, where your mental health issues like reside in some part of your mind. Like if we starve that part of your mind, basically erase your entire mind, then we're getting rid of that issue. And so we can reprogram you after that to be a healthy, well-adjusted person. And so in a way, therapy and brainwashing are, kind of, there's some overlap there.
There's some overlap, right? Totally.
Yeah. So what Lilly discovered was that, and well, he made the discovery that this wasn't necessarily torture. There is, therapeutic, like he enjoyed the experience. He reached a special state of mind. So, and this was something I think was observed to a lesser extent in the earlier experiments, but like you couldn't really get to it without the wet method. And even then that early one didn't, as we know, it didn't work very well. But the CIA was still very much interested in the wet method as well. And, they built a tank at Cornell, and with funding from the Human Ecology Fund, they did experiments with wet and dry sensory deprivation. And these were experiments that were specifically aimed at gauging like how well you could adjust somebody's behavior or modify their behavior or their beliefs and things like that.
And so with the wet float, they're also wet earbud speakers. They're putting ideas in your head as well, repeating phrases, something like that.
Yes. Yeah. At Cornell, they quickly decided that they would rely on the dry float method. But I know later on, the wet float method, like once it was refined, it was used a lot more. And there was all sorts of like therapy going on as well, like, even hypnotherapy combined with floating, which is supposed to be, a very powerful technique, but you can obviously see where, that could go wrong. So it wouldn't necessarily be torture, but it could be like conditioning as well to, much like it's probably used by the Navy SEALs today.
Oh, interesting. So you brought up Manchurian Candidate earlier, so I think it's just on my mind of what this could be used for. And
yeah, so there's a movie that came out in the early '60s called The Mind Benders, and it was definitely based on events around John C. Lilly because his experiments were actually publicized in the mid '50s. The director of the National Institute of Mental Health actually went before Congress and was talking about the brainwashing experiments they were conducting at the National Institute of Mental Health, and he started talking about float tanks. And it's really a fascinating. Like I can read a little bit from this article.
Drew and Kim, are you aware of this at all? Is this news to you?
Yeah, you can find the articles about it in the archives of the New York Times. But so Dr. Felix talking to Congress, he's explaining what is going on in John C. Lilly's experiments. And he says, that's the subject. He's placed in a tank of water at body temperature upside down, and he floats, said Dr. Felix. Now, this is a most comfortable feeling for an hour or two. It is the most relaxing thing. It is like floating in air. It is like going back before you were born. So this is like the 1950s, a guy telling this to Congress, which is hilarious. But then he goes on and, amazing too. Like,
Yeah, right. That's great marketing right there.
yeah, it was really good. But then he goes on to explain that in about an hour or two, he wakes up and finds his thoughts are going over and over, sort of like a closed circuit. He will get on some subject and go over and over it again. So the reason for this is deprivation of outside stimuli. And part of the reason that you or I do what we call logical thinking is that there are things that feed in through some source, some reception source, ears, nose, eyes, skin, whatnot, so that these things feeding in orient us and tell us when we are thinking and give us stimuli for additional thinking. With all these turned off, one is left with this closed circuit, and this begins to go around and magnifies, distorts, and completely changes the whole thinking process. So then a senator asks, is this a form of brainwashing? Senator Margaret Chase Smith. Yes, ma'am, it is, Dr. Felix replies. It is part of brainwashing. And then Felix goes on to explain, that they are going to replace, they're going to feed in their own signals. And once you do that, the person should be totally pliable and, able to be brought over to your point of view. So, and then the New York Times interviewed, the New York Times interviewed Dr. Lilly about it, and he stressed that like these experiments are, voluntary, and the subject knows he can get out at any time, so it's not like brainwashing, but that that this method could be used for that, and he definitely believed that. So shortly after this, actually, Lilly organized symposiums about brainwashing. And he was doing this at the same time that the Human Ecology Fund was...
I'm sorry. I know I'm interrupted you mid-sentence. So when we use the word brainwashing, language changes over time.
Right.
And I'm curious because... earlier when I was like, well, isn't that illegal? And you're like, well, I mean, it could just be a therapeutic use. Could we think of therapists now as being brainwashing using that same term from 50s and 60s? Like, does it mean something different back then that doesn't sound as intense as how we mean it now, or as manipulative or with ill intent?
Well, the way they're using it then was definitely with the connotations of ill intent, because
the CIA is not funding it for the betterment of everyone to have a
right. And also there was so at the time they were claiming that the communists were using brainwashing, and so that kind of served as basically an excuse for American scientists to be involved in this. Ostensibly it would be a defensive program. We have to learn how to do it because they're doing it, and then we can learn how to protect our agents or whatever from being brainwashed.
Great way to convince us to support it. That's good.
Yeah. And as far as like today's terms, I think it's an interesting question. The difference between therapy and brainwashing. It all depends on the motivation and I guess to some extent the methods. But
when they're talking in front of the Senate about using the term brainwashing, everybody knows what that means. Like that is very similar. Like when you're saying we're doing it to with the Russians, then
they're thinking this is what the communists did to And it was a very loaded word. Yeah, for sure. So Lilly's first public lecture about his float tank experiments took place at a symposium on brainwashing that he organized. And this was at the same time that the Human Ecology Fund was... they were given a project by the CIA to pretty much bring together all the literature and all the work that had been done so far, to bring it all together in one place. And so it really looks like Lilly was part of that project. Other people that were involved were Harold Wolff, who was the head of the Human Ecology Fund, and he had been involved in sensory deprivation work at Cornell, and was also so a definite MKUltra contractor. Good friends with Alan Dulles, who was the director of the CIA at the time. Lilly was right there, and he did these symposiums, 4 of them, for a few years. other people that were at the symposiums were Donald Hebb was there, Leo Goldberg, who was another sensory deprivation tank researcher at Cornell. The talks were sponsored by the Office of Naval Research, so it was like a military funded thing. And then after that, sensory deprivation research like really kind of exploded with the publicity, and there were like hundreds and hundreds of studies done in the late 60s on it. Jay Shirley, who went to work with Lilly in 1956 and really was the co-inventor of the sensory deprivation tank, he split off from the National Institute of Mental Health and went to the University of Oklahoma, I believe it was, and he continued sensory deprivation tank work there. He did that under the director of psychiatry there, or sometimes I say psychiatry, I mean psychology. The director of psychology at the University of Oklahoma was a guy named Louis Jolyon West. He is one of the most, enthusiastic scientists involved in MKUltra. He's kind of like a Forrest Gump of MKUltra and weird stuff. So he, like, before Shirley went to work for him, he had a CIA contract to investigate dissociative states, hypnotism, and drugs such as LSD for the CIA. And this is work he continued. In 1963, I believe, he somewhat famously gave LSD to an elephant named Tusco. And Tusco unfortunately died because of it, because he miscalculated the amount of LSD, he said. Or I think the actual cause of death might have been a drug that they gave to try to bring Tusco down or something. But it ended badly for Tusco. But this was a year before John C. Lilly was giving LSD to dolphins. So there was a lot of this stuff going around. And the reasons for Jolly and West giving Tusco the LSD aren't exactly clear either.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So he, so this was who Shirley was working with. One more story about Jolly West, just to kind of really cement who this guy was. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The assassination was blamed on Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by a man named Jack Ruby the next day, or very soon after the assassination of JFK. Louis Jolyon West paid a visit to Jack Ruby while he was being held in jail to do a psychiatric evaluation on Jack Ruby, and he went in privately, interacted with Ruby, and came out and said that Ruby had gone completely insane. And this was a CIA doctor who had previously claimed to be able to create states of insanity in people using drugs and hypnosis. So, yeah, again, the story was Ruby was fairly healthy and normal until Jolly West paid him a visit. And then after that, he was hallucinating he believed that there was a massive pogrom going on against the Jews of America, and that he was, like, his family was being killed, all these crazy things. He was never the same after that. So Jolly West actually paid John C. Lilly a visit a year after that to float in his float tanks down in St. Thomas. And you can find Jolly West's his entry in the book The Deep Self, which is a John C. Lilly book that, like, chronicles a lot of people's different float experiences. So I found Jolly West's name in there, which was very surprising. And it was surprising too, because it had to have been in a time when Lilly was down in St. Thomas, if the years are correct, which makes one wonder why Jolly West would travel so far just to visit Lilly and try out his float tank. So that kind of the end. Well, Lilly continued to do government projects like outside of float tanks. That part of his career kind of ended. The real float tank research seemed to have been being performed by other people like Jay Shirley and Leo Goldberger. And there's a lot of good stuff. There's, astronaut experiments and stuff like that. Lilly's other project at the National Institute of Mental Health was research into brain electrical stimulation of the brain. So he had been doing this since the early 50s. He invented a device called the Bovatron, which involved electrodes being implanted in the brain and reading out the responses by basically lighting up an array of light bulbs, so you could see what region of the brain are being activated by which thing. And then he later discovered the what he called the motivational centers of the brain. So pleasure, pain, fear, and I guess, very happy, like stimulating, positive experiences could all be elicited by planting electrodes into the brain and using small electrical stimuli. So this research was also of interest to the CIA. And towards the end of his career, or it might have been right after his work at the National Institute of Mental Health, when he was transitioning to dolphins, he wrote a paper called I got to abbreviate the title because I don't remember the whole thing. It's long, but it's on modified human agents. The paper went on to explain that through a combination of sensory deprivation and electrical stimulation of the brain, you could get what he called master-slave controls over a human being. And he also said in the paper that the extent that we'll be able to do this is going to depend on how many electrodes you can put in the brain. And so far they're working with hundreds, but someday they'll, maybe get up to thousands. And that he would continue these experiments to, try to come to the full answer of exactly how much control you can do on a brain. And so the question is, where was he going to be doing this, and on what brains? And it was dolphin brains. They were the next largest. No, their brains are larger than animals, but they're a good source of brains. And Lilly wasn't into performing experiments on people other than himself first. So there were experiments done on people with electronic stimulation of the brain done shortly after Lilly, made his advancements in the field, including on psychiatric patients and prisoners. Some rather ghastly stuff and stuff that isn't well documented. And Lilly he wrote articles complaining about this because it was some inhumane things going on. But he was going to be working on dolphins. And if you read Man and Dolphin, which is the first book he ever wrote, he explains his methods of controlling dolphins through electronic brain stimulation. Basically, instead of doing what regular dolphin trainers do, which is, feed the dolphin a fish every time it does what you want it to do, he was giving the dolphins stimulation in the form of an electrical pulse to the region of their brain that created pleasure. So he was remote training these dolphins directly through inputs into their brain to behave in certain ways. So you can kind of see like where that would, kind of link into possible military applications. And that his work, a lot is made of his dolphin research being funded by NASA. But really a lot of it came from the Navy as well. And I feel like the NASA is like, that's kind of the cover story about, interacting with the new species and this preparing us for space travel and extraterrestrials and stuff like that. I feel that the military was much more interested. Well, I know they're much more interested in weaponizing this technology and weaponizing the dolphins themselves. Lilly proposed in one paper, well, he recognized the intelligence of dolphins before almost anybody. And he also mentioned that if they could be convinced to work for the U.S. government, they could be invaluable allies. And this research was carried on for years. Well, there are like active dolphin, I don't know what you call it, like dolphin platoons or whatever in the Navy now. So that kind of sprang out of this. But what is less known was that the CIA had its own dolphin program in the early 60s. I think this only came out in like 2019 after some other documents were released, but it had a program called Project Oxygas, Oxygas, where they captured dolphins and trained them to deliver explosives to boats.
That's the one I'm aware of. That's
So Fidel Castro actually at one point said that he believed he was going to be the target of a dolphin-led assassination. I think he thought that they would deliver, I believe, an explosive seashell. But this was going on right around the time that Lilly was doing his work in around the same area too.
So, Marshall, I'm concerned about time. Like, is this going to have to be a two-parter or not? Because I feel like this story is not coming to a close anytime soon. But I'm also so curious about, from all the buildup of what you've talked about, where that's gone and what applications are being used. But I also have a feeling even more threads are going to be woven into this story as it keeps developing, because as you're telling the story, so much gets added to it, where I'm following one thread and it's like, oh, actually it keeps building outwards into these unexpected areas. Can I, and we can certainly keep talking for a little bit here, but I'm just curious if I can narrow in on the, whether it's therapeutic or the brainwashing of the mind, whether it's with electrodes, whether it's with spoken word, using sensory deprivation. Where did that lead to? Because it seems like research, part of the pun, but ended up tanking. But was there something that continued? Was there any knowledge of any further research or applications going forward?
Well, so it continued. And then, unfortunately, we won't ever know like the extent that it was used by the CIA, and, other intelligence agencies. But obviously the therapeutic, work continued. It was big in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of that's been published. The question of like how it could have been used in like covert operations is a good one, but we don't really know. We know that like Louis Jolyon West at one point asked the CIA to fund a laboratory where he would create a chamber that he would have total control over all the sensory possibilities. So that including, light, sounds, temperature, like everything. And it's not known if that ever got built. there's also just the wide use of sensory deprivation in like a little, I guess, less exotic, but like more effective methods, which is like what they do in prisons, like Guantanamo Bay. They basically, if you look at I showed this in my talk at the conference, but prisoners at Guantanamo Bay had their eyes covered. They had earphones over their head. They were put in dark rooms. They were put under sensory deprivation conditions. The CIA has a training manual called KUBARK, which also explains. It goes into enhanced interrogation, as well as assassination techniques and other things like that. But it references John Lilly extensively, and it talks about how sensory deprivation is it's basically a key tool in the tool chest of interrogating people, and to an unknown extent, behavior modification. Because, I mean, like getting somebody to confess or give up information, that's a form of behavior modification, but it's not all the way to creating a Manchurian candidate. So we don't know exactly how far they got in that direction, although, like, we can speculate.
Well, you gave this speech at the Float conference last year. I'm thinking about you being in front of a bunch of float enthusiasts, giving out all this information that this is not a Disney happy ending cartoon with your speech. So I'm curious, with you personally, how do you reconcile all this history and backstory to floating with what we have today? Like, how does that all just settle into your mind?
Well, I'm comfortable with the idea that float tanks exist because they're spun off of these secret government mind control programs. So many things in the government and in research in general are dual use. And we have a lot of the technology we have today because people were trying to find out, create weaponry. The military is responsible for so much. So, it's not that surprising that we have this, this apparatus that's very useful for therapy. Was spun off of government projects because that's just the way so much research in the United States already is. That includes biological warfare and things like that, leading to all sorts of advancements. The science is neither good or bad, but yeah, so many things including floating have this dual use capability.
And so we've been talking for about 45 minutes about this. How do you work all of this into an intro for a first-time floater? How does that? Does that work?
That's the question. I don't really have a good answer for, as far as what you're going to say now, if people ask where did this stuff come from? So that's just going to have to be up to you to decide. I haven't really tried it out yet. I've been waiting for somebody to ask me. It came from, where'd these come from? They came from secret government projects on mind control, but it turned into a good thing that we gotta love. Yeah.
Wild, man. Am I accurate in my assumption that there's a lot more that you want to share?
Yes. There's a lot more. There's Lily's. Because after this government work, he became a sort of leader in the psychedelic movement. And that's a whole other story, full of a whole other cast of characters and interesting connections. Cool. And honestly, I'm not done researching it yet. So, but there's much, much more. This is kind of just a snapshot.
Would you be willing to come back on when you're a little further on along
Absolutely,
your research and share some more? Because this is unnerving and fascinating.
I feel like I need to look into Dr. Hebb.
Donald Hebb.
Donald Hebb. Yeah. And what was it? What do you call it? Psychic driving?
Yeah, you and Cameron. Yeah, that's some of the most publicized stuff. It's a good place to start. Yeah, and there's some unfortunately very dark things there, but
I wish we could have taken a picture when you said that Dr. Hebb is the father of floating. We all our jaws all kind of dropped. We all had a reaction to that. I'm like, I've never heard of this guy. Who is this?
Yeah. Well, to be more precise, he's the father of sensory deprivation, but not floating.
Sensory deprivation. Okay.
Yeah.
Good point. Awesome.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you sharing all this information and taking us for a ride here, which is a nice, I mean, that's the format of a podcast. I think that's great that we get to go, from A to Z and take some digressions and learn a little bit more rather than just the quick synopsis, which I still feel like was a quick synopsis, which is why we'll need to get your book. So please definitely come on when the book is ready as well. But can you plug your podcast again? Because now I got to tune in.
Sure. Yeah. My podcast is Deep State History. And the best way to get there is our Patreon page. It's free. So far we're only taking donations. It's not something I do like every week. It's been a little while, but it's still definitely, a work in progress. So patreon.com/Deep State History.
Awesome. I'll be checking it out and seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes. It's always a scary thing to see beyond than what you perceive as the world. And you see how, it's always unsettling to me anyway.
I agree.
Marshall, thank you so much. Drew, did you have another? It looks like you're loaded with another.
No, I was looking at his podcast episodes and just kind of getting excited. I'm going to definitely check it out.
Oh, cool. And excellent.
I guess plug for the podcast, the Deep State History of John Lilly Part 1, Isolation, Brain Stimulation, and Modified Human Agents. Yeah. I'm excited to listen to that.
Nice. Yeah, I guess if you want that bridge from sensory deprivation into his podcast, there you go.
Yep.
Let's see here. Before we close out, thanks to my co-host, of course. Gloria's not here tonight, but thank you, Gloria, for being part of the team. Kim and Drew, thank you guys for being here tonight. Really appreciate you. And thanks to Olga for producing tonight's episode. Thanks to our sponsors. Thanks to Float Tank Solutions. Thanks to the FTA. Thanks to Mindful. That's with 2 L's, mindful.solutions. And, this is the one I forget all the time. Kim, thank you for taking show notes live as we record. I really appreciate that. I keep forgetting to mention that, but you have show notes for us each and every week, and I really appreciate that. And we also have a Patreon, patreon.com/Art of the Float. If you're interested in float media, float photography and video and scientific blog posts, etc., check that out. Check out shop.artofthefloat.com for photography videos a la carte, as well as some cool testimonial videos and t-shirts. Flux has some really cool designs on there as well. I'll need to put another plug for that on my Instagram because that is he has some really cool designs. And I should say Dr. Flux, actually. And I think that's about it. So thanks everybody for listening. And until next time, use float tanks for therapeutic purpose. Let's do it for the side of good. Have a good night.